The sun had barely risen over the wide, dusty fields when Ethan pulled on his worn boots and stepped outside. The morning air was cool, but it didn't ease the weight in his chest. His ranch, the land his father and grandfather had worked for, decades, was slowly slipping through his fingers. The barn roof leaked, the fences were falling apart, and the bank had already sent him 2 final warning letters. If things didn't change soon, he'd lose everything. Ethan stood for a moment and stared at the acres of dry grass stretching out before him. The land had always been his pride, his home, but lately it felt more like a battlefield. Every day was a struggle feeding the animals, fixing broken equipment, and trying to scrape together enough money to pay the bills. He had no family left to help him, no one to lean on when things got hard. He carried the entire weight of the ranch alone, and it was starting to break him. He wiped the sweat from his brow and went to the small barn to feed the horses. They nickered softly when they saw him, but he noticed how thin they were getting. There wasn't enough money for a proper feed anymore. Ethan did the best he could, cutting back on his own meals so the animals would have more. He patted one of the horses on the neck and whispered, "Hang in there, boy. We're gonna get through this somehow." But the truth was, he didn't know how. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table staring at the stack of unpaid bills. The ranch was his life, but it was bleeding money, and he had no one to turn to. A few neighbors had offered to buy parts of the land, but he refused. Selling would mean losing the only thing his parents had left him. He felt like he was drowning, and every day the water rose a little higher. The next morning, as Ethan was driving into town to pick up some cheap supplies, he overheard 2 men at the feed store talking about an event happening that evening. It wasn't the kind of event Ethan usually paid attention to. It sounded strange and a little unsettling. They called it an auction, but from the way the men spoke, it wasn't for cattle or equipment. It was for people. Ethan frowned as he loaded his feed bags into the truck. He had heard rumors about such things happening in small towns when times were hard. Young women with no families, no homes, and no one to protect them would sometimes be sold off to whoever was willing to pay. Some folks treated it as if it was just business, but Ethan knew there was nothing right about it. On the drive back to the ranch, he tried to push the thought out of his mind, but it kept creeping back. He needed help on the ranch. He couldn't keep up with all the work alone. Hiring someone wasn't an option. He didn't have the money for wages, but the idea of buying a person like property made his stomach turn. Still, desperation can push a man to consider things he never thought he would. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Ethan found himself driving toward the small building where the auction was being held. He told himself he was just going to look, that he wouldn't do anything, but his hands were sweating on the steering wheel. When he stepped inside, the room was crowded and noisy. Men in worn hats and dusty boots stood shoulder to shoulder, talking and laughing like it was some kind of show. Ethan kept to the back, his jaw tight. He didn't like the way the crowd looked at the young women who were brought out one by one. Some of the girls were barely adults, their eyes wide with fear. The air was heavy with the sound of the auctioneers' voice calling out prices and the occasional cheer when someone won. Ethan's stomach churned as he watched. He thought about leaving, about walking out and never coming back, but then he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 19. She was thin and pale, with long dark hair that fell in messy strands over her shoulders. She stood stiffly, her hands clenched together in front of her as the auctioneer spoke. There was something in her eyes that made Ethan pause. It wasn't just fear. It was exhaustion. The kind of look you saw in someone who had been fighting for a long time and was too tired to keep going. The crowd started shouting numbers, and Ethan felt a jolt of anger. The way they talked about her made her seem like an object, like she wasn't even human. One man near the front laughed and made a crude comment, and Ethan's hands curled into fists as he told himself again that he had no business being there, that he couldn't afford to do something so reckless. But when he saw the way the girls' eyes darted nervously from one bidder to another, he couldn't stay silent. 500. Ethan called out. The room went quiet for a moment, then the bidding started again. The price climbed higher, and Ethan felt his heart pound in his chest. He didn't have much left in his bank account, but he couldn't walk away now. $650. Another man shouted, $700, Ethan said firmly. The auctioneer's voice rose as the bidding slowed. 700 going once. Going. Twice. The gavel came down. Sold. The girl's head snapped up, her wide eyes meeting Ethan's for the first time. He saw confusion there, and fear, but also the faintest flicker of hope. When it was over, Ethan signed the papers and handed over the money, his hands shaking. It was more than he could afford, and he didn't know what he was going to do next. But as he led the girl outside into the cool night air, he felt a strange sense of relief. She didn't speak at first. She kept her distance, watching him carefully. As they walked to the truck, Ethan didn't blame her. She had no reason to trust him. He opened the passenger door and stepped back. "You can sit up front," he said quietly. She hesitated, then climbed in. Ethan started the engine and began the long drive back to the ranch. For a while, the only sound was the hum of the tires on the road. He wanted to say something to make her feel safe, but the words wouldn't come. After a few minutes, he finally said, "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." The girl turned her head slightly, but she didn't reply. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and Ethan could see the way her shoulders trembled. He knew it would take time for her to believe him. When they reached the ranch, Ethan showed her to the small spare room in the house. It wasn't much: a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the fields, but it was clean and warm. "This is your room," he said. "You can lock the door if you want. No one will bother you here." She glanced at him, then at the door, and nodded slowly. Ethan stepped back and said softly, "Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." He closed the door gently behind him and leaned against the wall, running a hand over his tired face. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He had spent money he didn't have and brought a stranger into his home. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had done the right thing. Outside, the wind howled across the empty fields. Ethan looked out the window at the moonlit land and whispered to himself, "We'll figure this out. Somehow we'll figure it out." The next morning, Ethan woke up before sunrise, as he always did. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch. Usually this was his favorite time of day, the only time the world felt calm. But today was different. There was someone else in the house now. He got up quietly and went to the kitchen to start the coffee. As the pot brewed, he glanced at the closed door of the spare room. He wondered if the girl was awake yet, if she had slept at all. He couldn't imagine how hard the last 24 hours had been for her. She was in a strange place with a man she didn't know, a man who had essentially bought her. Even if that wasn't what he intended, Ethan didn't want her to feel like a prisoner. He wanted her to understand she was safe now, that no one would hurt her here. But he knew it would take time for her to believe that. He poured himself a cup of coffee and went outside to feed the animals. The morning air was crisp, and the first light of dawn painted the horizon in pale orange. He tried to focus on his chores, feeding the horses, checking the water troughs, repairing a loose fence post, but his mind kept drifting back to the girl. When he finally returned to the house, he heard a faint sound from the spare room. He paused at the door, then knocked gently. There was a long pause before he heard her soft voice. "Yes? It's just me," he said, trying to keep his tone calm. "I was about to make breakfast. You're welcome to join me if you want." The door opened a few inches and she peeked out. Her dark hair was messy from sleep, and her eyes were cautious, like a wild animal unsure if it was safe to come closer. "You don't have to," Ethan added quickly. "I just thought you might be hungry." She hesitated, then stepped out slowly. She was wearing the same clothes as yesterday, and Ethan realized she didn't have anything else to change into. He made a mental note to find her some clothes later. They sat at the small kitchen table. Ethan cooked eggs and toast, and she watched, silently from across the table. He tried to start a conversation, but every question he asked seemed to make her retreat further into herself. Finally, he decided to stop pushing when he placed the plate of food in front of her. She looked at him like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to eat. "Go ahead," Ethan said gently. "It's yours." She picked up the fork and began to eat slowly. It was clear she hadn't eaten a proper meal in a long time. Ethan sat across from her, sipping his coffee, unsure of what to say. After a few minutes, he asked quietly, "What's your name?" She froze for a moment, then said in a barely audible voice, "Clara." Ethan nodded. "Clara, that's a nice name." She didn't respond, but she didn't look as frightened as before. That was something, at least. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Ethan went back outside to work, but he kept glancing toward the house, wondering what Clara was doing. He didn't want her to feel abandoned, but he also didn't want to overwhelm her. When he returned around midday, he found her standing in the doorway, watching the horses in the corral. "Do you like animals?" he asked, walking up the steps. Clara nodded hesitantly. "Would you like to meet one?" he asked. She hesitated again, but finally gave a small nod. Ethan led her to the corral and introduced her to one of the calmer horses, a gentle brown gelding. He showed her how to hold out her hand so the horse could sniff it. Clara's eyes lit up when the horse nuzzled her palm. She reached out and stroked its mane, and for the first time since Ethan had met her, she smiled. It was small and fleeting, but it was real. "You're good with him," Ethan said softly. Clara looked at him, startled, then quickly looked away. As the days passed, she began to spend more time outside. She helped Ethan with small tasks around the ranch, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, sweeping the barn. She didn't speak much, but Ethan noticed how careful and hardworking she was. One evening, they sat on the porch as the sun set. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the air was warm. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, "You don't have to help with the work, you know. You're free to do whatever you want here." Clara looked at him with confusion. "Free? Yes," Ethan said. "You're not. I didn't buy you to make you work for me. I just didn't want anyone else to." He stopped himself, unsure how to finish the sentence. "You're safe here." "That's all I wanted." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said finally. Ethan nodded. "Then stay as long as you want." They sat in silence after that, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Ethan felt a strange sense of peace sitting next to her. He hadn't realized how lonely he had been until now, but life on the ranch was still hard. The bank kept sending letters, and Ethan worried constantly about money. Some of the neighbors started whispering about Clara, making assumptions about why she was living with him. Ethan ignored the gossip, but he could see it bothered her. One afternoon, as they were mending a fence together, Clara asked softly, "Why did you buy me?" Ethan paused, setting down the hammer. "Because I didn't want anyone else to. I couldn't stand the thought of what might happen to you." Clara looked down at the ground. "You don't even know me." "I didn't have to," Ethan said. "I just knew you didn't deserve to be there." She didn't reply, but she seemed to relax a little after that. Over the next few weeks, Clara began to open up more. She told Ethan bits and pieces about her past, how she had lost her parents young, how she had been passed from one foster home to another, how she had eventually ended up with someone who treated her like a burden. "I've never really belonged anywhere," she admitted one night as they sat by the fire. "You belong here," Ethan said quietly, "if you want to." Clara didn't answer right away, but she didn't look away either. There was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. Ethan felt something shift inside him in that moment. He had brought Clara here because he wanted to protect her, but now he realized he cared about her in a deeper way. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he didn't want her to leave. Still, he kept those feelings to himself. Clara needed time, and he wouldn't push her. The ranch continued to struggle, and Ethan worried more each day about how they would survive. But having Clara there made the burden feel a little lighter. She worked hard beside him, and her quiet presence brought a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Clara said softly, "Thank you for everything." Ethan looked at her in surprise. "You didn't have to take me in," she said, "but you did, and I'm grateful." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're here." Clara gave him a small smile, and for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe they could build a life together, but he also knew the world wouldn't make it easy. The bank, the gossip, the uncertainty about the future, it all hung over them like a storm cloud. As Ethan stood on the porch that night, looking out over the moonlit fields, he whispered to himself, "We'll get through this. We have to." Inside the house, Clara stood at the window, watching him. She didn't know what the future would bring either, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. The days on the ranch slowly began to find a rhythm. Ethan would wake up before sunrise, start the morning chores, and Clara would quietly join him. At first, she only helped with small tasks, like carrying buckets of water or gathering eggs from the chicken coop, but soon she learned how to feed the horses, mend fences, and even guide the cattle when they needed moving. Ethan noticed how quickly she picked up new things. She was hardworking, and even though she still carried a quiet sadness in her eyes, she was determined to be useful. Ethan appreciated her help more than he could say. Before Clara had arrived, he had been drowning in responsibilities, constantly rushing from one task to another, never getting ahead. With her there, the work felt lighter. But it wasn't just the help that mattered. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt alive again. Clara rarely spoke about her past, and Ethan never pushed her. He could see she was still healing from everything she had been through. But sometimes, late at night when the wind was quiet, she would tell him little things. About how she had grown up in a small town before her parents died. About how she had moved from one place to another after that, never really belonging anywhere. Ethan listened carefully to every word. He wanted her to know he cared, even if he didn't always know how to say it. One morning, as they were feeding the horses, Clara asked softly, "Why do the neighbors look at me like that?" Ethan stopped what he was doing and glanced at her. She was standing by the fence, stroking the horse's mane, but her shoulders were tense. "They're just nosy," Ethan said gently. "People in small towns like to talk. They don't know you, and sometimes people make up stories when they don't understand something." Clara bit her lip and looked down. "I don't like the way they look at me, like I'm something bad." Ethan walked over and stood beside her. "You're not bad, Clara. You've done nothing wrong. If they can't see that, that's their problem." She nodded, but he could tell her mind was still heavy with worry. Ethan hated that people's gossip was hurting her. He had never cared what the neighbors thought about him, but now it was different. He wanted to protect Clara from their judgment. As the days turned into weeks, Clara became more comfortable on the ranch, but there were still moments when Ethan could see her fear come back. Loud noises startled her. She would tense up if someone unexpected came to the ranch. One afternoon, a delivery man from town stopped by with supplies, and Clara quickly retreated into the house, peeking out from behind the curtains. "She's shy," the man commented as he handed Ethan the packages. Ethan didn't bother explaining. It wasn't shyness. It was the kind of fear that didn't disappear overnight. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Ethan gently said, "You don't have to hide every time someone comes by. This is your home now. No one can take you away from here." Clara was quiet for a long moment before she whispered, "I just don't want to be sent back." Ethan felt a heaviness in his chest. "No one is sending you back. You're safe here, Clara, I promise you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of trust in her eyes. Despite the peace they were building on the ranch, life was still hard. The bank continued to send letters warning Ethan that he was behind on payments. He kept the letters tucked away in a drawer, not wanting Clara to worry, but the stress weighed on him constantly. He spent long hours working, trying to find ways to make extra money, but nothing seemed to be enough. One night, after a particularly long day, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Clara walked in quietly and set a plate of food in front of him. "You didn't eat dinner," she said softly. Ethan lifted his head and managed a small smile. "I wasn't hungry. You worked too hard," Clara said. She hesitated, then added, "You're always tired. I see it." Ethan sighed. "The ranch, it's struggling. I'm just trying to keep it going." Clara sat down across from him, her hands clasped together. "Is it because of me?" Because you had to spend money on me? Ethan's heart ached at the question. No, Clara, don't ever think that. You're not the reason the ranch is struggling. It's been hard for a long time. I'm glad you're here. You make things better, not worse. Clara looked down, her voice barely a whisper. I don't want to be a burden. You're not? Ethan said firmly. You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch in a long time. Her eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. As weeks turned into months, Ethan and Clara's bond grew stronger. They began to share more moments together, little things that made life feel lighter. Clara started humming while she worked in the kitchen, and Ethan found himself smiling at the sound. Sometimes they would sit by the fire at night talking about simple things, the weather, the animals, the plans for the ranch. But the outside world still intruded on their small bubble. The gossip in town grew louder. People whispered that Ethan had bought a young girl to keep her on the ranch, that he was taking advantage of her. Ethan ignored the rumors, but he knew Clara heard them too. One afternoon, when they went into town for supplies, Clara kept her head down the entire time. She could feel the stares, hear the murmurs behind her back. When they got back to the truck, she said quietly, I hate going into town. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I know, but we can't let them control how we live. They don't know us, Clara. They don't know the truth. Clara nodded, but he could see the pain in her eyes. That night, Ethan sat awake. Long after Clara had gone to bed, thinking about everything. He wanted to protect her, but he also knew they couldn't go on like this forever. People would keep talking and the bank's letters wouldn't stop. He needed to find a way to make things right, not just for himself, but for Clara too. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a decision in his heart. He didn't know exactly how he would do it, but he knew one thing. Clara needed to be protected legally. If something happened to him or the ranch, he didn't want her to be left with nothing. That day, as they worked side by side repairing a broken gate, Ethan kept glancing at Clara, wondering how to bring it up. Finally, he set down his tools and said, Clara, can we talk about something important? She looked at him with a hint of worry. What is it? Ethan took a deep breath. I've been thinking about how to make sure you're safe. Right now, if anyone came here asking questions, I don't have any legal way to protect you. I don't want you to ever be in danger again. Clara frowned, unsure where he was going with this. I think... Ethan hesitated, then said quietly, I think we should get married. Clara's eyes widened in shock. Married? Yes, Ethan said. Not because I expect anything from you. But if we're married, no one can take you away. You'd have a home, security. People wouldn't be able to question why you're here. Clara looked down at the ground, her hands twisting nervously. I don't know. I've never thought about marriage. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. I understand, Ethan said softly. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I just want you to think about it. I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. For a long time, Clara didn't say anything. Then she looked up at him, her voice quiet but steady. You've done more for me than anyone ever has. I'll think about it. Ethan nodded, relieved that she hadn't said no. He knew this wasn't a small decision, and he didn't want her to feel pressured. As they finished their work that day, Ethan couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the path forward inside the house that night. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about everything Ethan had done for her, about how he had given her a place to belong when she had nowhere else to go. The idea of marriage scared her, but so did the thought of losing the one place where she felt safe. She whispered softly into the darkness, What should I do? Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of the fields. Clara closed her eyes and tried to imagine a future where she wasn't running anymore, a future where she could finally call a place home. The following days on the ranch felt heavier than usual. Ethan continued his work as he always did, but Clara could see the worry written on his face. He didn't talk about it much, but she knew he was thinking about what he had said about marriage. She had been thinking about it too. The word itself felt big, almost too big for her to hold on to. She had never imagined such a thing for herself, not after everything that had happened in her life. Yet she couldn't deny that Ethan's Words made sense. Each time she stepped into town, Clara could feel the stares from people, the way they whispered behind her back. She could pretend to ignore it, but the judgment weighed on her heart. She had worked so hard to rebuild a little piece of herself on the ranch, but in town she was reminded of what others thought of her. Ethan's proposal wasn't about romance or fairy tales. It was about giving her a sense of security. She understood that now. One evening, Clara stood at the edge of the fields, watching the sun set behind the hills. The sky was burning orange and gold, and the wind carried the sweet smell of grass. She thought about the first night she had arrived at the ranch, how scared she had been, how uncertain. But Ethan had never once hurt her or treated her poorly. He had only shown kindness. She thought about how safe she felt under this roof, how she no longer woke up afraid in the middle of the night. She knew her answer. That night, Clara found Ethan sitting on the porch. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring out at the dark fields. She walked over slowly and sat beside him. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began softly. Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "About marriage?" Clara nodded. "I'll do it." For a moment, Ethan just stared at her as though he hadn't expected her to say yes. "Are you sure?" "I don't want you to feel like you have to." "I'm sure," Clara said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "You've done so much for me. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about both of us. And I want to stay here. I don't want to lose this." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "Thank you, Clara. I promise I'll make sure you're protected, no matter what." The decision was made, but it didn't make things easier. They would need to arrange everything quietly. Ethan didn't want the whole town talking, and Clara didn't want any attention. He reached out to an old preacher who lived a few towns over, someone he trusted to be discreet. The preacher agreed to come to the ranch in a few days to perform the ceremony. In the days leading up to the wedding, Clara felt a strange mix of emotions. She was nervous, of course, but also a little hopeful. She kept reminding herself that this wasn't a typical marriage. She didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't, and she didn't have to fear the person she was marrying. Ethan was already someone she trusted. Ethan, on the other hand, worked harder than ever. He fixed up the small chapel-like space in the barn where the preacher would conduct the ceremony. He cleaned and repaired things he had ignored for months. He wanted everything to look right for Clara, even if it was just a small, simple moment. On the morning of the wedding, Clara woke early. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room, brushing her hair slowly. She didn't have a fancy dress or anything new to wear, but Ethan had given her a clean white blouse and a long skirt that fit well. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized the girl staring back. There was still a trace of the old fear in her eyes, but there was also strength now. Ethan waited outside the barn as the preacher arrived. There were only a few people there, an older neighbor and his wife who had been kind to Ethan over the years. They had agreed to be witnesses and nothing more. The group gathered in the barn, where the afternoon sunlight streamed in through the open doors. Clara walked in quietly, her hands folded nervously in front of her. Ethan felt his chest tighten when he saw her. She looked beautiful, not because of her clothes, but because of the calm determination on her face. The preacher began the ceremony, his voice steady and warm. Ethan and Clara stood side by side, listening, as he spoke about trust and commitment. Ethan glanced at Clara every so often, and each time he did, he could see her breathing slowly. As though steadying herself when it came time for them to say their vows, Ethan spoke first. "Clara," he said softly, "I promise to take care of you, to protect you, and to give you a home where you never have to be afraid again. I know this isn't the way either of us imagined it, but I want you to know that I'm grateful you're here. You've made this place feel alive again." Clara's eyes glistened, but she held her voice steady. "Ethan, you gave me a place when I had nothing. You showed me kindness when no one else would. I promise I'll stand by you and do my best to make this home as much yours as it is mine." The preacher nodded with a small smile. "Do you take each other as husband and wife?" "I do," Ethan said without hesitation. Clara looked at him, her heart pounding, and said, I do." The preacher pronounced them married, and the small group clapped softly. There were no rings, no flowers, no music, but there was a warmth in the room that felt bigger than any of that. After the ceremony, Ethan and Clara stepped outside into the golden light of the setting sun. The fields stretched out before them, glowing softly in the evening breeze. Ethan turned to her and said, "It's done. You're safe now, Clara. No one can take you from here." Clara nodded, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you, Ethan." They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just watching the sun sink below the horizon. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she belonged somewhere. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was no longer alone. That night, they sat together at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal. Ethan didn't say much, but he kept glancing at Clara as though he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Clara, too, felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, life could get better from here. But the world outside the ranch didn't change overnight. Word of their marriage spread quickly, and while some people stopped whispering, others only whispered more. There were still judgmental looks in town, still people who thought they knew the truth about their lives. Ethan ignored it as best he could, focusing instead on the ranch and on making Clara feel secure. He knew they had a long road ahead. The bank's letters hadn't stopped, and the ranch was still struggling. But he also knew he wasn't fighting alone anymore. Clara began to settle into her new role. She managed the house with ease, cooked meals, and took care of the animals alongside Ethan. She even began going into town again, though she kept close to Ethan's side. Each time she walked with her head a little higher. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, Clara looked out at the fading light and said quietly, "I don't feel afraid anymore." Ethan turned to her, surprised by the statement. "You made this a home," Clara continued, "and for the first time I feel like I have a life worth holding on to." Ethan reached over and gently placed his hand over hers. "We'll hold on to it together," he said. Clara smiled softly. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The challenges weren't gone, and the future was still uncertain, but they had each other. And for now, that was enough. The first few weeks after the wedding felt different, but in a good way. Clara moved about the ranch with a little more confidence now. She no longer hesitated before entering the kitchen in the morning or walking outside alone. The small gold band on her finger didn't feel heavy. It felt like a quiet reminder that she belonged here, that she had a place where she was safe. Ethan noticed the change in her and felt relief every time he saw her smile. It wasn't a big, loud smile, just a soft one, but it meant the world to him. He had worried that marrying her might make her feel trapped, but instead she seemed more at peace. The ranch still demanded long hours of work, and the money problems didn't disappear, but they faced everything together. Clara learned how to wake up before dawn with Ethan, and the two would feed the horses and cattle side by side. She was no longer afraid to get her hands dirty. She even learned how to handle some of the old ranch tools, laughing quietly when she struggled at first but refusing to give up. One morning, after a particularly long day of repairing fences, Ethan walked into the barn to find Clara brushing one of the horses. She hummed softly as she worked, the sound blending with the rustling of hay. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You've gotten good at that," he said, smiling. Clara turned a little embarrassed. "I like it. It's calming. The horses, they seem to trust me now." "They trust you because you're gentle with them," Ethan said. "Just like you are with everything here." Clara didn't say anything at first, but the corner of her lips lifted slightly. "I'm starting to feel like this is my home, too." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. "It is your home. It always will be." As the weeks passed, Clara started suggesting small ways to improve the ranch. She had a knack for organizing things and noticed how much time Ethan lost searching for tools or fixing things in the house. She cleared out the storage shed, labeled every piece of equipment, and even replanted the small garden behind the house so they could grow more vegetables. "This will help cut costs," she said one afternoon, wiping the dirt from her hands. "We won't have to buy as much food from town." Ethan looked at the neat rows of seedlings she had planted. "You're amazing," he said honestly. Clara shook her head. "I just want to help." And she did. Slowly the ranch began to feel more organized and manageable. Ethan still worried about the bank and the bills piling up, but he felt less alone now. Clara's presence gave him strength. One evening they were sitting on the porch after a long day of work. The sky was glowing with the soft colors of sunset, and the crickets were starting their nightly song. Clara sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, staring out at the horizon. "I was thinking," she said quietly, "maybe we could turn part of the ranch into a place for others who need help. People like me, people who don't have anywhere else to go." Ethan turned to her, surprised. "You mean like a shelter?" Clara nodded. "We have space. It wouldn't have to be big at first, but I know what it feels like to have no one, and I know how much it meant when you gave me a chance." Ethan thought about it for a long moment. The idea felt big, maybe even impossible, given how tight money was. But when he looked at Clara's hopeful expression, he realized she wasn't just dreaming, she was talking about building something meaningful together. "That's a good idea," he said finally. "If we can make it work, I'd like that too." Clara's face lit up. "We'll figure it out," she said with quiet determination. They didn't have the resources to start right away, but the idea gave them something to work toward. Clara began writing down plans in a small notebook, sketching ideas for cabins or extra rooms that could be built. Ethan admired her determination. She was no longer the scared, uncertain girl who had arrived at the ranch months ago. She was growing into someone strong and capable, and he felt proud just to stand beside her. Of course, life wasn't without its challenges. The gossip in town still lingered, though it had quieted some after the marriage. There were still people who looked at Clara with judgment, whispering things they would never dare say aloud. Clara tried to ignore them, but Ethan could tell it still hurt. One day, after they had returned from a supply run in town, Clara sat at the kitchen table in silence. Ethan set the bags down and sat across from her. "What's wrong?" Clara hesitated, then said, "Sometimes I feel like no matter what I do, people will always see me the way they want to. Like I'll never be good enough for them." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand gently. "You don't owe anyone anything, Clara. What matters is how we see each other. And I see you as the strongest person I know." Clara's eyes softened. "I just want to make you proud." "You already do," Ethan said. "Every single day." Clara squeezed his hand, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. As the months passed, the ranch slowly began to recover. Ethan and Clara worked hard to cut costs and sell more cattle. They even found ways to earn a little extra money by offering horseback riding lessons to families in town. Clara was nervous the first time she had to teach a child how to ride, but she quickly discovered she was good at it. Her calm, patient nature made the children trust her instantly. One afternoon, after a successful lesson, Clara and Ethan sat by the corral, watching the horses graze. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I think we're going to be okay." Ethan smiled softly. "I know we will." They still dreamed about turning the ranch into a place where others could find safety and a fresh start. It would take time, but Clara's notebook was filling with plans, and Ethan was determined to make it happen. He knew how much it meant to her, and he wanted to give back too. On a warm summer evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Clara stood at the edge of the fields, remembering the night she had first arrived at the ranch. She had been terrified then, unsure if she would ever feel safe again. Now she looked at the house glowing softly in the distance, the sound of Ethan working in the barn, and she realized how much had changed. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a home, a partner, and a purpose. Ethan walked up behind her and wrapped a comforting arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. "About how far we've come," Clara said with a small smile. "About how grateful I am that you didn't walk away that night." Ethan squeezed her shoulder. "I'm the one who's grateful, Clara. You saved this place as much as I did." They stood there together, watching the sky turn dark and the stars appear one by one. Life wasn't perfect. There would always be work to do, challenges to face, and people who didn't understand them. But they had each other, and that was enough. Later that night, as they sat by the fire inside the warm little house, Ethan looked at Clara and said softly, I think this is just the beginning for us. There's so much we can do together. Clara nodded, her eyes bright. I believe that too. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with a golden glow. Clara rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, feeling a deep sense of peace she had never known before. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for the next disaster, the next loss. She was building something real, something lasting, outside. The wind rustled through the fields, carrying the promise of a new day. And for Clara and Ethan, the future felt wide open, full of hope.